In this video, we're going to talk about the importance of acknowledging uncertainty. One other thing I'd like to acknowledge is that this video is virtually verbatim from Peter Sandman's essay on acknowledging uncertainty. Most people hate uncertainty. They'd much rather you told them confidently and firmly that A is dangerous or B is safe, C is going to happen or D isn't going to happen, E is a wise precaution to take, or F is a foolish one. People don't like to hear that we're just not really sure. Of course, anything you tell them confidently and firmly that turns out false generates outrage. People get angry or fearful. And with some justice, people feel you misled them. The result will certainly damage your credibility and thus your ability to manage this situation and future situations. Maybe worse, people's mistrust of you will rub off into their attitude toward the risk itself. But that doesn't keep them from pressuring you beforehand to sound more certain than you are. In fact, the pressures come from all sides. Affected parties, politicians, regulators, your employer, your peers, your audience, and yourself. Everyone wishes you knew more, and everyone pushes you to pretend you do. It isn't easy to hold on to your uncertainty, to insist that you're not sure. To some extent, people's response to uncertainty depends on their attitude toward the hazard. Outraged people get more outraged when the expert's reassurances come with uncertainty attached. Apathetic people, on the other hand, get more apathetic when warnings are admittedly uncertain. If the experts aren't sure it's dangerous, why should I be? Similarly, the pressure is usually strongest to make your reassurances more confident, to say everything will be fine, when what you really ought to be saying is we hope we get through this okay. Finally, the cost of confident warnings that turn out false is lower than the cost of confident reassurances that turn out false. So let's take a look at some tips for how to sound uncertain. The first tip is to ride the risk communication seesaw. Someone is going to point out the uncertainties. Ideally, that someone should be you. That would leave the public free to occupy the more confident seat on the seesaw. Acknowledge the uncertainty up front before you're confronted with it. Tip number 2 is to try to replicate in your audience your own level of uncertainty. So you need to know how uncertain you are. Then tell people what you know for sure, what you think is almost but not quite certain, what you think is probable, what you think is a toss-up, what you think is possible but unlikely, and what you think is almost inconceivable. Put bounds on the uncertainty. What range of possibilities is credible? Clarify that you're more certain about some things than others. The third tip is to avoid explicit claims of confidence. Reserve the word confident for things you'd bet your mortgage on. Hopeful is a better word for desirable outcomes that are likely but not certain. And don't imagine that the hedge words that you use let you off the hook. For example, if you say, at this point in time, we are 100% sure the emissions are safe to breathe, that's still unacceptably overconfident, despite the introductory phrase that you use. Where appropriate, point out explicitly that you are not confident. Even better, predict that some of what you now think is true will probably turn out wrong. This is the best way to keep changing circumstances from being seen as earlier mistakes, or worse yet, earlier lies. Tip number 4. Convert expert disagreement into garden variety uncertainty. When experts disagree about a risk, the public can get very nervous. But faking an expert consensus that isn't there is sure to backfire. Your best bet is to report everybody's risk estimates, even those of your critics. The company says X, the regulators say Y, the activists say Z. By framing the risk in terms of the range of expert opinions, you avoid the risk communication worst-case scenario where we have equally confident experts with their uncertain judgments going head-to-head with one another. Tip number 5. Make your content more tentative than your tone. Confidently telling the public you could well be wrong inspires trust, even as it alerts them to the genuine uncertainties of the situation. The reverse combination, claiming to be sure in a tone that sounds very unsure, that's disastrous. Tip 6. Show your distress at having to be tentative and acknowledge the public's distress. You wish you could be sure, but you know you can't. Despite the uncertainties, you're able to make necessary decisions and recommendations. This models the reaction you want the public to have. Show you're aware that the uncertainty distresses the public as well as yourself, and show you think that the public can bear it too. Explain what you have done or are doing to reduce the uncertainty. Don't perpetuate uncertainty. If there are ways to answer the question that you should be pursuing, say so and pursue them. But if the remaining uncertainty is very small or very difficult to reduce further, say that. Don't overpromise. Tip number 8. Don't equate uncertainty with safety or with danger. Never say there is no evidence of X when you haven't done the study that tests the possibility of X. Never imply that the absence of definitive proof that something is dangerous proves that it is safe. Never imagine that risks are innocent until proven guilty. On the other hand, think hard before you buy into the widespread assumption that most industrial products and processes are hazardous, whether the experts know it or not. Number 9, explain how uncertainty affects precaution taking. The greater the uncertainty, the more justified the precautions, not because you're sure the risk is serious, but because you're not sure that it isn't. How far to take this precautionary response is always debatable. Sometimes there is no reasonable choice other than bearing that uncertain but probably small risk in preference to one that may be better understood but is probably more serious. Other times there are options that are both safer and less certain. Sometimes it's easier to reduce an uncertain risk than to measure it more certainly. Don't hide behind uncertainty. If the risk is probably significant despite lingering quality control problems, say so. If it's probably trivial despite some unanswered questions and weird exceptions, say that. Most of the time, uncertainty should be something you discuss reluctantly, acknowledging that it weakens your case. If you find yourself asserting that uncertainty strengthens your case, pause and reconsider your case. Number 11, expect some criticism for your lack of confidence. The only alternative is criticism for overconfidence, often from the same critics, and that's worse. Finally, don't go too far. You could come across as bumbling, timid, indecisive, or terminally self-deprecating, but this problem is rare. The more common problem is coming across as arrogant and overconfident. Your goal is the middle, but you can safely aim for the opposite extreme. You won't overshoot. And take heart. The research on acknowledging uncertainty shows that it does diminish people's judgment of your competence, but not as much as sounding certain and turning out to be wrong. It actually increases people's judgment of your trustworthiness as well. Since sources of risk information typically score high on competence and lower on trustworthiness, this isn't such a bad trade-off.